Hello, we're going to do the week 7 uh, lecture videos, but before that, just remember if you're having any trouble with anything, please reach out and we'll see what we could work out. But otherwise, this is going to be a little bit of a long video. We're doing the related topics of physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia, and that has 4 articles. So I'm going to try to walk the line between giving you too much and too little, and try to give you the ease over the tougher parts so you can dive into the rest. We'll start, as always, with the Vaughn, who gives a very nice overview. And I just want to draw your attention to a few things. So, one, he rightly points out that some of the really hard parts with euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide both is the mess with legal and policy, because you have to answer questions it's not clear you could answer objectively, and things like that. Second of all, of course, is the role of autonomy and what someone's directives about such issues are. If you really love your family, get an advance directive, get a living will. Never make somebody try to guess what you would want in difficult situations. So, to show how messy these things can get, Vaughn points out the Terry Schiavo case, which was very famous at the time. Schiavo was in a persistent vegetative state. Uh, and wakeful, but clearly not conscious, uh, clearly no intentionality, was not a person anymore in the technical philosophical sense, and there was no chance of recovery. And the husband said, well, that's not Terry anymore, and so let us remove the life support and let her go peacefully. Terry Schiavo's parents sued against that, and it became a giant mess. Think of all these family members who were tortured because of no living will. So just one of those things, as an aside, it's definitely a good thing to do. But let's talk about euthanasia first. Euthanasia literally translates from a good death, so it's to directly or indirectly bring about a death for that person's sake. So um, if there is such a thing or not is might be contentious, but that's the general idea. You're killing someone for their interest. So um, there are 2 divisions here. Uh, First of all, there's the active passive distinction in euthanasia. Quite simply, active is killing, passive is letting die by not prolonging. And so that's one distinction. Rachel's is going to argue that is not a relevant moral distinction, and we'll look at that argument later. The other distinction is between voluntary and non voluntary, not to be confused with involuntary. So, voluntary means the patient requests or agrees to the euthanasia. Non voluntary is when the patient doesn't do it because they are not competent. So, they're not able to make those choices, such as being in a coma or persistent vegetative state, and have not disclosed by living will what they wish to be done. That's non-voluntary. So the case of when they eventually pulled the plug on Terry Schiavo, that was passive, letting die, non-voluntary. There is technically involuntary, which is against someone's will. That doesn't really happen in the medical setting. Maybe that might happen in the battlefield once in a while or something like that, but where the person's going to die anyway and they stab them even if the person says no, that would be involuntary. So careful with your language. Non-voluntary is what we're interested in for this course. And then there's physician-assisted suicide. So that is exactly what it sounds like. The patient takes their own life. That's why it's suicide rather than euthanasia, with the doctor's help, usually by prescription of lethal dose of painkiller or sleep medicine. And we're going to look at one article from that first. And so uh, be advised, be advised that all of these might have different moral principles. For instance, one of the issues with physician-assisted suicide is, well, does it carry professional duties and things like that? So some people immediately say, well, what about the Hippocratic Oath? I should probably clarify, doctors don't take the Hippocratic Oath. That's uh, some doctors do once in a while, just kind of for history's sake, but that's not the actual oath that doctors take anymore. Um, so just be it. But there's there's still do not beneficence obligations and things like that. So just be careful not to overstate on theses, because some considerations might count against, say, active but not passive, or might count against non-voluntary but not involuntary, or voluntary, etc. So just be careful and be mindful. And then lastly, the Vaughn points out this is one that has very deeply religious connections. So uh, regular churchgoers are 60% of them are against euthanasia in any form, whereas those who seldom or never go to church, only 14% are against euthanasia. So there's clearly some religious issues that intertwine with this. So when we're reasoning through, be sure we are, as always, focusing on the ethical considerations. All right, that's all I have to say about the Vaughn. The Quill article is an interesting one, and I wanted to start with it because a lot of people tend to think of euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide in the abstract, and looking at a very specific case study, in this case, the case of Diane, is useful. And it's useful just to really understand, what families go through, how these decisions are made, et cetera, et cetera. But it also brings up some important points. So I'll skip the background because you should be able to pick that up from the reading. But if we look at Quill's position, Quill was the doctor. Um, One, it seemed that the motivation for Diane, the reason she wanted to do this, um, was that physician-assisted suicide allowed her to keep control of things and die on her own terms and with dignity. And so that's a big and important motivator. And the family accepted the decision. The second thing I want to draw attention to is uh, one. Remember, Quill felt uncomfortable at first, but slowly comes around, and a big part of that has to do with this important notion of constant communication. They're always talking back and forth, uh, and that the background tragedies in Diane's life established in his mind that she was of sound mind, that she was independent and confident in the decision, and those were really important to it as well. And in this case, the reason that the doctor eventually decided to write this article is because, in his opinion, he thought that um, Diane received the best care possible, that this was ultimately the best thing that could have been done for her, and therefore you might think of it in terms of serving beneficence. So it's an interesting short article if you haven't read it yet, but it really kind of goes through the emotions and decision making process of it. So that's our only article on physician assisted suicide. When we turn to the euthanasia, we start with the Brock article, and Brock is writing specifically about voluntary active euthanasia. That is, the person says, I want to die, and is allowed and is actively done so. So there's a couple of very interesting things in Brock. I don't want to go line by line because, again, you should still be reading these, and I know this video is going to go long anyway. But first of all, there's this importance of autonomy, that when we're talking about the patient's right to decide, there's something really important going on here. And what Brock does, and what many supporters of euthanasia do, is start with the easy case, right? we usually think that it is morally permissible um, to deny treatment if you don't want to deny treatment anymore. And so, to use our previous language, when we're talking about that, that is usually considered voluntary passive euthanasia. That I have the right to not take treatment. Imagine what a bizarre and terrible world it would be if I went home from the hospital with a bad diagnosis and uh, doctors, with the assistance of police, forced their way into my home and started jamming medicine in my veins. That's definitely not the world we live in. We do not think that uh, forcing treatment on someone is correct when they don't want it. And so what that establishes is, well, we're already okay with voluntary passive euthanasia. And the move Brock is going to make is to say, but if we look at the same things that make us arrive at that decision, they apply to active euthanasia as well. We still have individual self determination and individual well being as the motivators. That is why they are making this decision, the same as in the other case. And so the fact that one's active and one's passive doesn't seem to impact that justification. So, and the reason for that, well, ultimately we are pursuing our own conception of the good life, which everyone has a right to do. But he also adds, again, just kind of expanding this main reasoning, is that there's no one clear line of this is when life becomes not worth living. That's a very personal question. It might be different for me and for you about when life is no longer worth living. And so we should allow self-determination in these cases. Now, of course, that self-determination doesn't compel physicians. We can't force a physician to help us in these things. Uh, but that is the general idea of the argument is we're okay with, we seem like we're in a position where we should accept voluntary passive euthanasia, uh, but for the same moral reasons we should accept the other. And he justifies that with the case one, case two, etc. The other reason I assigned the Brock article, and I won't go through them all here, is he does a very nice job of going through the main issues, the good and the bad, at the policy level. And so I won't go through those, but what he comes up with as his conclusion is if we are making policies on euthanasia, the requirements seem to be one, that the patient is fully informed. Two, oh, by the way, notice how this applies to the Diane case as well. It seems to implicitly comfort Quill. But fully informed, Brock is going to add stable wish. The patient continually wishes to die instead of just in a moment of despair. Uh, Three, all the alternatives have been explored. And four, the patient has undergone a psych evaluation to make sure they are of sound mind. And by the way, this is a general policy, but the states who have legalized euthanasia do have very similar to the Brock. So those are the highlights from the Brock, that he thinks that it's morally justifiable in the same way passive is, and then he really digs into on some policy issues. Turning to the Callahan. So the Callahan is our main argument against euthanasia in when self-determination runs amok. So working backwards, towards the end of the article, Callahan talks about what are some consequences of policy when it happens. So he's looking specifically at the Dutch euthanasia policies and what some of the problematic consequences were of that. And so, first and foremost, there was abuse of the law. That uh, if you don't agree with the law, you can bend it or ignore it, and then law enforcement doesn't prioritize the law even when it's broken. Uh, Two, the Dutch law also ran into difficulties with precision in writing, like when euthanasia becomes okay. It needs language like unbearable and da 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 da, and it's just these kind of things that are not objectively enforceable. And then three, and these are all related, by the way, he calls it the slippery moral reasons, that uh, that relief no longer requires competence, and so decisions become about value of life, not about health, and that's where doctors are not qualified, as we've talked a little bit about before when we're talking about the the paternalism issues. Well, doctors just aren't experts on your life generally; they're just experts on health. So these are three consequences that happened, or at least Callahan saw as happening in the Dutch inaction of the legalizing of euthanasia. And of course, those are obviously problematic. But then to start at the beginning of the article and say just a few more things about what some of his considerations were. First of all, there's this legitimizing killing flies in the face of most contemporary trends. Most of the time, most laws and social movements are trending the other way. And so that's one concern. The second concern is that it might require you to enroll others in your notion of the good life. So anybody who's trying to help you with this, you'd have to go against their own values and buy into your claims about the good life. And then ultimately, it's an abuse of medicine to say that it's medicine's job to help me achieve the good life or the good death in this case. That's not medicine's job. Medicine is to treat your health. Um, so let's expand on these a little bit. First of all, he'll point out that euthanasia isn't self-determination. We always say that. We always talk about autonomy, but it's mutual, right? You end up doing it with somebody else. That's certainly true of euthanasia. It's even true of physician-assisted suicide. So the doctor becomes empowered in this and ends up treating your values instead of your health. But probably the most important thing is that Callahan, unlike Rachel's, who we're going to look at, and unlike Brock, wants to say that no, the killing, letting die distinction is a central, meaningful distinction because letting die is agency. Sorry, killing, what am I saying? Letting die is biology. Killing is agency. Those are different when you're talking about what caused a death. Uh, those are importantly different. So why do they always get blurred? Such as in the Brock, he thinks that when we're blurring this killing, letting die, and say, oh, they're really the same morally, this is confusing causality and culpability. That culpability is ultimately about what you're to blame for, uh, but it's not the same as causality. So you did it, but you're not to blame is a different claim than you didn't do it. So uh, he thinks there's this very important distinction between killing and letting die that must be preserved, and as such, we must reject euthanasia. So using that as a jump off point to the last article, Rachel's is going to give multiple reasons. It's a 5 reasons for why the killing and letting die distinction is not ethically relevant. And so, just to step back for a second, notice the Rachel's article is actually written in a medical journal, and he's writing it to doctors. And so he's starting with the usual policies, and traditionally, especially when Rachel's wrote this article, uh, the standard doctor ethics line was, well, doctors are allowed to let die; they are not allowed to kill. And by not allowed and allowed, I mean it is morally permissible to let die. It is impermissible or wrong to kill. So that's the background that Rachel's is working against. And he's going to try to get rid of that. He's going to say, no, killing and letting die is not what's morally relevant here. And he's going to give 5 reasons for that. Um, so in the order he gives them, first of all, he's going to say when the decision is made. So that is when the patient decides they're going to die. Once the decision is made, active, that is killing, is actually the more humane option. So he gives, these extremely painful throat cancer, for instance. Well, once somebody decides they want to die, uh, you're basically going to either sit there and let them rot and starve to death. That's agony, or a quick boop. And so the decision's already been made, which means now we just need to measure beneficence or well-being. In this case, the least suffering, and that is uh, what Rachel thinks is going to be with active euthanasia in these cases. Um, very similarly, he gives some examples of when Down syndrome babies were born, the parents had an option to choose not to to fix this very common intestinal issue, and if they choose not to fix it, the infant dies and dies in pain. But notice this leads to the second one, is that very often the decision of life or death is on irrelevant grounds. The decision to let die or kill in that case was based on the fact that the baby had Down syndrome, not based on uh, the intestinal issue itself. And so the choice there isn't killing and letting die. The choice is, why is this one being killed or let die? The third one, he's going to make this argument that it's not, before he makes this argument, people who are against active euthanasia, but okay with passive, very commonly say that it's always worse to kill and let die. And for his third reason, he's going to say, well, no, we can imagine some cases where it's not obviously worse to let die than it is, or sorry, to kill than it is to let die. And so he gives the Smith and Jones case. But that's the goal of what it's trying to draw out. It's trying to show you can't just assume that killing is always worse than letting die. Sometimes they're the same. The fourth one he's going to point out is that another reason the active passive is a little bit of a bogus distinction is because the doctor still does something in passive euthanasia. They choose not to treat. And that choice is subject to moral appraisal. And so there is a decision made by the doctor that amounts to deciding that patient's going to be terminal. So because the doctor is still deciding something and that decision is still the basis for moral appraisal, then really the fact that it's active or passive is not what's relevant here. Lastly, the thing, and again, this is based kind of on his critique of policy, since we're in a largely policy unit, is uh, euthanasia seems to be the legal forcing the moral. That the doctors are allowed to let die legally, but they are not allowed to kill legally. And that has nothing to do with what the doctor thinks is right or wrong. That's simply the law trying to force a certain moral code, which is funny because remember, Unit 1 of the course, uh, you know, enforcing morality is never the job of law, and so that's another concern as well. And again, reminder: all of these together are Rachel saying, look, the relevant moral distinction, the relevant moral decisions about euthanasia are not whether it's active or passive, contra Callahan. So those are our authors for the week. I hope I gave you enough of an outline to start digging into these and maybe understand and situate them a little better. If not, as always, reach out. Otherwise, I know that the course was on the accelerated pace and it's hard to run on the treadmill that long, but I hope you got something out of the course. I hope you found it meaningful. I hope you take some good stuff out of it. And I hope that you treat this as the beginning of your uh, reflection and thoughts on these matters rather than the end. Otherwise, have a great rest of your year.